From the start, Binet refuses the comfortable distance of abstract speculation. He begins by reminding us that any serious study of reasoning must be rooted in observation, in experiments, in direct encounters with the mind in action. He warns against treating reasoning as if it floated apart from other psychological phenomena. Instead, he insists that reasoning is a function of the mind, subject to the same constraints, the same imperfections, the same interplay of forces that govern perception, memory, suggestion, and emotion. To grasp reasoning, one must descend from lofty logic into the raw terrain of lived thought. He situates his project historically. Logic, philosophy, formal systems have long attempted to define the rules of correct thinking. But Binet argues that those systems tell us more about ideal forms than about how real minds operate. The pure syllogisms, the strict deductive chains, they exist in textbooks. In life, reasoning is messy. It is shaped by habit, suggestion, bias, uncertainty, incomplete evidence. Binet wants to bridge the gap to show what reasoning is when it is exercised by human minds, not by idealized logicians. To proceed, Binet must begin by clarifying terms. He treats reasoning not as a monolith, but as one among various mental operations. He places it in relation to association, judgment, and reflection. Association is basic. Ideas bring forth related ideas through contiguity, similarity, or experiential links. Judgment is closer to reasoning. It involves weighing, distinguishing, selecting. Reasoning builds upon judgment. It links premises to conclusions, infers unseen relations, projects consequences. Yet Binet insists on distinguishing reasoning from simple inference or prediction. Reasoning, he says, demands an inner synthetic operation. It reshapes and reconfigures the given data. Reasoning is not merely drawing a conclusion from two facts. It is interrogating those facts, testing alternative paths, navigating uncertainty. It proceeds by steps, sometimes visibly conscious, sometimes partly hidden from awareness. He acknowledges that these distinctions are not always sharp. In many ordinary acts of thought, association, memory, judgment, and reasoning blend. Yet for purposes of investigation, the distinctions are necessary. What this really means is that when one studies reasoning experimentally, one must be careful. Control the influence of association, isolate judgment, reduce interference from memory and suggestion. Binet then turns to the historical and theoretical precedents. He surveys past philosophers and logicians, noting how they have often assumed the mind as a passive medium through which reasoning flows unimpaired. He cites theories that treat reasoning as if it were a mechanical linkage of premises and conclusions, ignoring the psychological complexities, the bias, fatigue, hesitation, insinuations of feeling. He criticizes any approach that treats reasoning as though it were divorced from the rest of mental life. He argues that the psychological approach to reasoning must proceed in two directions: observation and experiment. Observations drawn from real cases, spontaneous thought, everyday reasoning, testimony, errors, supply material. Experiments must artificially isolate conditions to see how reasoning behaves under variation with limitations of time, suggestion, distraction, partial evidence. Together they reveal laws or tendencies, not ironclad rules. The objective is not to replace logic, but to map psychology's domain, to show the manner, the frequency, the limits of human reasoning. In offering this framework, Binet emphasizes humility. He does not promise to overthrow logic or to prescribe a universal theory of reasoning. His aim is more modest: to describe how people actually reason, under realistic constraints, and how deviations from logical ideal forms arise. He anticipates that many of those deviations arise from the very structure of the human mind: limits of attention, interplay of suggestion and memory, hidden associations, automatic inferences. He wants to uncover which of those are inevitable, which are modifiable, and which might yield to instruction or cultivation. From there, Binet moves to preliminary definitions. Reasoning is the operation by which the mind goes from premises to conclusions in a consciously controlled fashion. Judgment is the faculty of estimating, discriminating, classifying, deciding. Association is the spontaneous linkage of ideas by contiguity or similarity. Reflection is the self-scrutiny of thought, the turning of attention upon one's own process. Suggestion is the influence exerted by external stimulus or by the mind itself's memory, prior beliefs, habits which may bias reasoning. He stresses that suggestion is pervasive. It creeps into premises, into how evidence is perceived, into which inferences the mind finds acceptable. He also introduces the distinction between reasoning in idealized conditions and reasoning in ordinary life. The idealized model of logic offers clarity, coherence, necessity. But in life, premises may be uncertain, information incomplete, distractions present. Thus, the psychologist must consider not only what reasoning would be under idealization, but, more importantly, what reasoning is under constraints. What this means in practice is that one cannot simply assume perfect clarity of premises. The experimenter must check how subjects interpret, misinterpret, omit, or supply premises. He cannot assume pure neutrality of inference. He must test the influence of suggestion, prior belief, expectation. At every step, Binet shows reverence for empirical grounding. He refuses to accept any statement simply as theoretical. Even a definition must be scrutinized by experiment. To call something reasoning is not enough. One must show, under controlled conditions, that the mind performs that operation reliably, under variation. He insists that the psychological method must remain open. One must allow for negative results, for failures, for anomalies, for unexpected paths. He warns against two errors. The first is overgeneralizing from ideal logic to ordinary reasoning. The second is making everything experimental and ignoring the richness of spontaneous thought. He wants both modes. The historian of thought offers insights, the clinical observer offers examples, the experimentalist offers control. The unity of approach will expose principles, tendencies, and limits. Another point he makes: many acts of reason go unnoticed, partly unconscious. The mind does much work below awareness. It constructs inferences, dismisses unlikely possibilities, filters noise, even fits premises to conclusions. The psychologist must remain alert to that hidden work. Hypnotism is one tool Binet proposes to access less conscious paths, to see what minute or peripheral processes contribute to reasoning. It is not a magic method. It has limits, risks, interpretations. But it may disclose subthreshold associations, latent inferences, implicit premises that the conscious mind did not notice. In this opening, Binet also notes that reasoning cannot be isolated from individual differences. Age, education, temperament, personality, mental fatigue all influence how reasoning plays out. Two people may receive the same premises yet reach different conclusions because of differences in how they weigh suggestion, how they tolerate ambiguity, how they resist inclination. Hence, a full psychology of reasoning must allow variation. It cannot subsume all minds under a single ideal. It must understand the distribution of deviations around that ideal. Binet directs attention further to the conditions of the experiment, the time allowed, the complexity of premises, the degree of suggestion, the clarity of premises, the order in which premises are offered, even the manner of wording or phrasing. All these may shift outcomes. He makes the important claim that the same reasoning problem, differently phrased, yields different performance. What this really means is that reasoning is fragile. It is sensitive to peripheral cues, to framing, to context. The psychologist must track not only the content of reasoning, but also its form of presentation. He also reflects on limits. The psychologist cannot expect reasoning experiments to yield final laws as in physics. The human mind is too variable, context too important. But one can hope to find regularities, tendencies, invariances under variation. One may hope for probability laws under these constraints, Reasoning fails this often. Under that framing, biases emerge, confidence behaves so. Errors cluster in particular patterns. That level of law would already be a serious contribution. By the close of this introductory segment, the reader should feel the shift. We are no longer in the domain of pure logicians, but in the domain of the mind doing its difficult work. The map changes. The task is no longer to erect an ideal grammar of reasoning, but to chart the terrain of real thinking, its obstacles, its warpings, its resilience. Binet ends by reminding us that the psychology of reasoning is young. He evokes a cautious optimism. Much remains unknown. But the promise is high if one can grasp even a few of the constraining tendencies. One may correct error, instruct better, and better align how minds think with how minds ought to think. Reasoning, considered from the standpoint of psychology, is not a detached or foreign operation that interrupts the natural course of mental life. It is one among the essential functions of the mind, born of the same soil that nourishes memory, association, attention, and judgment. To understand it clearly, one must see how it emerges from the most elementary operations of thought, and how it distinguishes itself from them without losing the signs of kinship. It is an error of abstraction to take reasoning as a unique and isolated process, like a machine placed apart from all the other workings of the mind. Instead, it is interwoven into the fabric of mental activity, showing its specific character only when we examine closely the manner in which ideas are linked and conclusions are drawn. The first operation that calls for our attention is association. Ideas do not remain solitary within consciousness. They attract and summon one another, bound by past experience and contiguity. When a child who has often played in a garden hears the word tree, it awakens in him images of leaves, flowers, the shadow of branches on the grass, and the games he invented there. Association proceeds without effort, often without awareness. It does not involve criticism or deliberate control. It is automatic, a current carrying thought forward along lines inscribed by habit. If association were the sole principle of our mental life, man would be a creature who repeats endlessly the chains of his impressions, never correcting, never resisting, never constructing beyond what memory provides. Yet association, indispensable as it is, does not suffice to explain reasoning. Judgment represents a higher degree of activity. Here the mind does not merely allow one idea to follow another, it takes a stance, affirms or denies, classifies, distinguishes. The child who says the tree is tall has not only connected tree with tall, but has affirmed a relation. He has made a judgment. Judgment involves attention, for the subject must seize upon a particular quality and unite it with an object. It also involves comparison, for to say tall is to imply relation to a measure or to other objects less tall. Judgment thus marks an advance upon simple association. It introduces choice, affirmation, the first elements of criticism. Still, judgment does not yet equal reasoning. It remains fixed upon one relation at a time and does not necessarily carry the mind forward from premises to conclusion. Reasoning, properly so called, introduces movement of a new order. It is not only the linking of ideas by association, nor merely the affirmation of a quality in judgment, but the transition from one or more propositions to another, which is their consequence. To reason is to construct, to move beyond what is given, to arrive at a new idea supported by the preceding ones. It is a synthesis controlled by consciousness in which the mind deliberately seeks relations, weighs their bearing, and arrives at a conclusion. The distinction may appear subtle, but it is fundamental. Without it, one confuses reasoning with every mental act that suggests or recalls, and one loses sight of what makes reasoning an operation of its own order. Let us illustrate. If one hears the word fire and immediately thinks of warmth or of light, that is association. The ideas of warmth and light are bound in experience with that of fire. Their succession is natural and automatic. If one says fire is hot, that is judgment. One has affirmed a relation, taken a stand, united subject and predicate. But if one says where there is smoke, there is fire, therefore smoke rising behind the house indicates fire, that is reasoning. The mind has connected two judgments, compared them, and drawn a new conclusion which was not explicitly contained in the first idea. It is this transition, this step forward, that characterizes reasoning. The difference is not merely verbal. It is felt in the experience of thought itself. Association flows with spontaneity, one yields to it without effort. Judgment requires attention, but often proceeds quickly and unconsciously. Reasoning, by contrast, brings a sense of labor. It compels the mind to hold several ideas together, to examine their relation, to direct the course of thought in order to arrive at something not already given. The feeling of effort that accompanies reasoning is the sign of its complexity, the mark of the new synthesis it demands. Still, reasoning does not always follow the forms of logic taught in schools. Syllogism, with its strict structure, represents an ideal type. But in ordinary life, reasoning often proceeds in less explicit steps, sometimes by analogy, sometimes by implicit comparison, sometimes by rapid and half-conscious leaps. One recognizes a face by noting similarities to other faces one has seen, though one cannot formulate at the moment the precise marks of resemblance. One concludes that an action will bring danger because of vague memories of similar actions followed by harm. These are forms of reasoning, though incomplete and sometimes faulty, because they involve the same fundamental act, the mind passing from certain given facts to a new conclusion supported by them. Another example shows the distinctions even more clearly. Suppose a boy sees a footprint in the soil. Association might bring to his mind shoes or the person with whom he once walked. Judgment might lead him to say this footprint is large. But reasoning begins when he says a large footprint indicates a man of great stature, therefore a tall man has passed here. The conclusion is not in the immediate perception, but derived from it by inference. Whether the inference is correct or not is another matter. The essence is that the mind has moved beyond the data. If later he adds that the depth of the footprint shows the man carried a heavy burden, he has pushed the reasoning further, combining new judgments into fresh conclusions. One sees here the kinship, yet the distinction. Association supplies material, judgment affirms relations, but reasoning organizes, combines, and projects forward. Without association, there would be no ideas to relate. Without judgment, no recognition of relations. Without reasoning, no advance from relations to consequences. Reasoning thus crowns and directs the simpler operations, though it is always supported by them. The psychology of reasoning must therefore analyze not only the structure of syllogisms, but the living interplay of association, judgment, and inference. The child who learns is not taught by logic alone. He is swayed by suggestion, by memory, by the authority of elders, by his own preferences. To say that he reasons is to acknowledge that, within this complex field, he makes connections that lead him to conclusions. Sometimes these conclusions are sound, sometimes erroneous, but always they are shaped by the fundamental operation of passing from premises to consequence. The most striking fact in early observation is how natural reasoning appears in children, even before they receive instruction in logic. A little girl sees clouds and says it will rain. She has observed the connection many times, and though she cannot express the chain formally, she reasons clouds have often preceded rain, therefore clouds now mean rain will come. This is primitive reasoning by induction and analogy. Another child, seeing that a candle melts in flame, infers that wax will melt when placed near fire. This again is reasoning from particular experiences. He draws a general law and applies it to a new case. The form is not exact, the steps are not explicit, but the psychological process is there. It is useful also to consider the errors. The child who believes that because the rooster crows before sunrise, the crowing causes the sun to rise, is also reasoning. He has observed a relation and concluded causality. The error lies in mistaking sequence for cause, but the operation is genuine reasoning, not mere association. He has gone beyond data to inference. In such errors, we see the natural tendency of the mind to seek causes and draw conclusions, even when evidence is insufficient. Thus, the psychology of reasoning does not merely celebrate correct inferences. It studies the very manner in which correct and incorrect ones are formed. For the mental operation is the same, the mind connecting premises to consequences, whether soundly or not. To understand reasoning is therefore to understand why the same operation sometimes yields truth and sometimes error. It is to understand the influence of habit, suggestion, and belief upon the formation of conclusions. The mind does not always know when it is reasoning. Often the steps are compressed, abbreviated, unconscious. One concludes rapidly, without being able to state the chain of ideas. Asked why one believes rain will come, one simply says the sky looks so. Yet beneath this vague expression lies a whole series of associations, judgments, and past experiences organized into an inference. Reasoning in its living form is rarely explicit. It is often a subterranean work, with only the conclusion rising to the surface. The psychologist must therefore learn to detect the hidden steps, to draw them out by experiment or interrogation. From all this, it becomes evident why reasoning must be studied as a specific operation and not confused with other mental acts. Association gives succession, judgment gives affirmation, but reasoning gives consequence. It alone enables man to pass beyond immediate impressions, to reconstruct the past, to anticipate the future, to form science, to regulate conduct. It is not an exotic faculty added to the mind from outside. It is the highest form of its natural operations, emerging when association and judgment are guided and directed toward new conclusions. This is the ground upon which the psychological study of reasoning must build. It must observe the simplest cases, distinguish them from mere associations and judgments, multiply examples from everyday life, and show how even in the errors of children and the naive reasoning of untrained minds, the same fundamental operation is at work. Only then can one advance to the analysis of more complex reasoning, to experiments with syllogisms, to studies of suggestion and belief. Reasoning in its nature is continuous with the rest of mental life, yet distinct in the role it plays. By clarifying this role, psychology prepares the way for deeper inquiry and for a true science of thought. The syllogism has long been regarded as the perfect instrument of reasoning, a kind of intellectual mechanism by which one moves infallibly from truth to truth. The philosophers who elaborated it intended it to be the expression of reason itself, the model to which all valid thought must conform. According to this conception, every time the mind reasons, it employs, whether it knows it or not, the form of the syllogism. Major premise, minor premise, conclusion such as the triad that contains the secret of rational thought. Yet when one examines reasoning as it actually takes place in living minds, one finds that the syllogism in its classical form is an abstraction, a purified scheme. It represents not the natural process of thought but its logical ideal, a skeleton from which much of the flesh and blood of psychology has been removed. To understand the psychology of reasoning, one must not only analyze the syllogism, but also study how far real reasoning resembles it, where it departs, and what errors and simplifications emerge when ordinary minds attempt to use it. The structure of the syllogism is simple. If all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, then Socrates is mortal. Two judgments are combined, and from their union follows a third. The first proposition is the major premise, the second the minor, the third the conclusion. To the logician, this appears an operation of necessity. If the premises are true, the conclusion cannot fail to be true. The relation is fixed, mechanical, as precise as an equation. This is the glory of syllogistic logic. It provides an instrument of certainty, a guarantee of truth, provided the premises themselves are certain. To this extent, the syllogism represents the perfection of deductive reasoning. But when one looks closely at the psychological process by which people arrive at such conclusions, one perceives a difference. Rarely does a man in the act of thinking pause to construct formally his major and minor premises. He does not say to himself, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. What happens is simpler and less explicit. The notion of mortality is attached in his mind to the category of men, and the name Socrates being recalled as belonging to that category, the predicate mortality is immediately attributed to him. The major premise, though logically indispensable, is psychologically latent. The mind passes rapidly from the individual to the attribute without traversing consciously the universal proposition. The syllogism is there in germ, but reduced to an abridged and practical form. This psychological abbreviation is of great importance. It shows that reasoning in practice does not employ the complete apparatus of logic. The general proposition is often omitted because it has already been assimilated, engraved in memory, implicit in the association of ideas. To say that one reasons syllogistically is true only if one admits that the syllogism may remain in part unconscious, with only its conclusion appearing clearly in consciousness. Reasoning is often reduced to the application of a rule without the explicit statement of the rule. We say this man is mortal because he is a man, not because we have before our eyes the proposition all men are mortal. The form is implicit rather than explicit. The consequence is that reasoning in everyday life is filled with shortcuts and ellipses. The complete logical form is exceptional, a product of training. Children, the uneducated, even the educated, when not engaged in formal tasks, all reason in abridged forms. They leap from case to conclusion without stating the general law. They often confuse induction with deduction, analogy with causation. What matters for them is the practical link, the immediate conviction, not the rigorous chain of premises. If one attempted to transcribe all their reasonings into syllogisms, one would be obliged to invent premises which they never thought of, to supply missing links, to reconstruct a chain that was only half formed in their minds. This is why logic and psychology, though related, cannot be identified. Logic prescribes the ideal form, psychology describes the actual process. The errors that arise from these simplifications are numerous. One common error is to treat particular associations as universal laws. If a child has always seen a dog bark, he may infer all dogs bark, and when he meets a dog that does not, he may conclude it is not a dog. Here the syllogism is malformed. The major premise is too narrow, too hastily generalized. Another error is to slip in unnoticed premises, smuggled by prejudice or belief. If someone says this man is untrustworthy because he is poor, he has introduced a hidden major premise. All poor men are untrustworthy, which he may never state explicitly, but which directs his conclusion. The syllogism thus reveals, when reconstructed, the prejudices and assumptions that silently govern thought. It is also remarkable how often the conclusion is assumed in advance and the premises adjusted to support it. The logical order is reversed. Instead of moving from premises to conclusion, the mind moves from desired conclusion to premises. One believes Socrates guilty, therefore one seeks the premises that will demonstrate his guilt. This is reasoning in appearance, but in truth it is rationalization, a psychological tendency that logic condemns, but psychology must study. It shows that the syllogism, far from being an exact picture of actual reasoning, is often an instrument bent to the service of conviction and passion. Yet even in its distortions, the syllogistic form retains value. By reconstructing reasoning into syllogisms, one can detect errors, hidden premises, and fallacies. The psychologist who asks his subject to explain his conclusion often finds that what seemed a direct judgment conceals a syllogistic structure. The child who says it will rain because there are clouds is reasoning all clouds bring rain. There are clouds, therefore it will rain. The premise all clouds bring rain is false, but the reasoning is syllogistic. In this way, the syllogism serves as a model by which we may analyze, though not reproduce exactly, the processes of thought. One may go further and note that the syllogism in its logical purity is often too rigid for life. Everyday reasoning tolerates probabilities, approximations, incomplete data. The man who sees smoke rising infers fire. The syllogism would require a universal premise: wherever there is smoke there is fire. But in fact there are exceptions, such as smoke machines, mist, dust. Still the inference is useful, often true, and necessary for action. Human reasoning cannot wait for universal certainty, it proceeds on partial evidence. Logic, to preserve necessity, demands universals. Psychology, to preserve reality, admits probabilities. Thus we see again the divergence between the two. The simplification of reasoning shows itself also in the use of analogy. One sees that because a disease was cured by a certain remedy in one case, it will be cured in another. This is not a strict syllogism, but it is reasoning, and often it serves well enough. The syllogism would require a general premise: all cases of this disease are cured by this remedy. But the mind dispenses with this, satisfied with similarity and probability. Analogy, then, is a natural form of reasoning, less exact than deduction but more accessible, and psychology must take it seriously. In studying errors, one finds that many arise not from ignorance of syllogism, but from the natural tendency to simplify. The mind dislikes long chains of reasoning, it prefers shortcuts. It jumps from premises to conclusion, leaving gaps filled by belief, prejudice, or habit. These gaps are the openings through which error enters. The logic of the school warns against them, but the psychology of everyday thought shows how irresistible they often are. The man in the street does not test each premise. He is guided by suggestion, authority, and experience. He reasons enough to reach conviction, not enough to satisfy logical rigor. From this point of view, the syllogism appears as both indispensable and insufficient. It is indispensable as the schema of valid inference, the norm by which we judge. It is insufficient as the description of how minds actually work. It must be complemented by the study of association, suggestion, analogy, and belief. Only then can one have a full psychology of reasoning. To demand that every reasoning be syllogistic is to misunderstand the richness of mental life. To deny the syllogism altogether is to lose the instrument by which errors are exposed. The truth lies in recognizing that human reasoning oscillates between the logical ideal and the psychological reality. Thus, the psychology of syllogism is a study of contrasts between the rigor of logic and the looseness of everyday thought, between the explicit form and the implicit process, between the necessity of the conclusion and the probability of conviction. It is in this contrast that the subject gains all its interest. For by analyzing how people depart from the syllogism, we learn how they actually think. By reconstructing their errors, we see the role of prejudice, suggestion, and simplification. And by comparing their processes with the syllogistic model, we measure the distance between logical ideal and psychological fact. In conclusion, the classical syllogism, while the pride of logic, is only one aspect of reasoning. Psychologically, reasoning is more fluid, more abbreviated, more fallible. Yet the syllogism remains the guiding thread, the scheme to which thought tends and by which it may be corrected. To study it is not to reduce all reasoning to its form, but to recognize in it the ideal toward which reasoning aspires and from which it departs. The task of psychology is to trace both the aspiration and the departure, to show reasoning in its purity and in its errors, to reveal how the human mind, in its labor to know and act, employs forms at once rigorous and simplified, ideal and imperfect. The study of reasoning cannot remain in the region of theory or in the contemplation of logical forms alone. To discover how minds truly operate, one must descend into experiment, where conditions can be arranged, observations multiplied, and errors analyzed with precision. It was in this spirit that I undertook to devise tests, simple in appearance, yet capable of revealing the processes by which children and adults arrive at their conclusions. The aim was not to prove that men can reason logically, for this is already known, but to show how far their reasoning departs from the logical model, what influences divert it, and what tendencies it obeys when left to its natural impulses. Experiment allows us to grasp the delicate mechanism of thought, to note where it halts, where it hastens, where it goes astray. The method I employed was to place before subjects certain problems expressed in the form of short statements or questions, sometimes resembling syllogisms, sometimes involving analogies, sometimes inviting classifications. The conditions were kept simple, for I did not want to test memory or erudition, but the capacity to infer. For example, I would say all metals expand by heat. Iron is a metal. What happens when iron is heated? Or I might ask, if roses are flowers and all flowers are plants, what is the rose? The point was to see whether the subject could pass from premises to conclusion without confusion or omission. In other cases, I used absurd or contradictory premises to test whether the subject would reason upon them logically or reject them instinctively. Thus I might say all fish can climb trees. This animal is a fish. What does it do? Here the subject who follows logic answers it climbs trees, while the subject who resists absurdity refuses the inference. This resistance, though natural, reveals a conflict between logic and belief. And it is in such conflicts that the psychology of reasoning appears most clearly. Among children, the experiments revealed a remarkable variety. Some accepted premises without hesitation and drew conclusions rigorously, even when the premises contradicted their experience. They would say that a fish climbs trees because the syllogism demanded it, showing that they could isolate reasoning from belief. Others resisted, saying that fish do not climb trees, and so the conclusion was false. These children subordinated logic to knowledge, refusing to reason upon what they deemed impossible. Between these two extremes lay many gradations, and the distribution of responses showed that reasoning is not uniform but guided by temperament, by imagination, by confidence in authority, and by habit of thought. I recall the case of a boy of 10 to whom I gave the problem, all men are animals, all animals are plants, therefore what are men? He paused, laughed, and replied, men are plants, but that is not true. He had reasoned correctly from the premises, yet his experience protested, and he was divided between logic and truth. This conflict is typical. It shows that reasoning in children is not the cold mechanism the logicians imagine, but a living process subject to the play of belief and the resistance of knowledge. The child is not a machine for syllogisms. He is a mind struggling between different impulses. Adults also showed such variations, though in subtler form. When faced with absurd premises, the cultivated man often refuses to reason, declaring the question nonsensical. He protects his dignity by refusing to play the game. Yet when persuaded to accept the rules, he may reason rigorously even upon absurdities. Others, less trained, mix belief with reasoning, correcting the premises to suit reality before drawing the conclusion. Thus the experiment discloses a fundamental fact, that reasoning in practice is not a pure form but a compromise between logical necessity and psychological inclination. Another class of experiments involved analogies. I would present series such as hand is to glove as foot is to what? The subject must supply shoe. Here the operation is reasoning by analogy, a natural form of inference, but one that reveals the tendencies of association. Children sometimes answered foot is to stocking or foot is to ground, showing that their association did not follow the strict analogy but wandered toward contiguity. In such cases, we see reasoning merging with association. Adults, too, sometimes failed when the analogy was less familiar, or when distraction led them astray. The analogy tests thus confirmed that reasoning is fragile, easily diverted, and that it demands a certain control of attention to keep association in check. Classification exercises offered another window. When asked to group together words such as dog, rose, chair, horse, some children placed dog and horse together as animals, others grouped rose and chair as things of the house. The principle of classification varied according to the dominant idea. Reasoning here consisted in selecting the essential relation among many possible ones. The child who grouped rose and chair was not illogical, he simply chose another link. The experiment revealed the multiplicity of possible associations and the need for guidance in selecting the relevant one. It showed that reasoning is not only deduction, but also discrimination. The art of finding which relation matters. One of the most instructive patterns observed was the tendency toward abbreviation. Many subjects, especially children, jumped to the conclusion without stating premises. When asked to explain, they hesitated, for the steps were unconscious. This confirmed what I had suspected, that reasoning is often compressed, reduced to the conclusion alone, with the chain of thought hidden. By questioning carefully, one can sometimes reconstruct the missing links, but often they remain implicit. This abbreviation is both economical and dangerous. It saves effort, but it permits errors to slip by unnoticed. The experiment thus uncovers the hidden economy of thought, its desire to arrive quickly, to dispense with labor, even at the risk of error. In the study of errors, I found recurring types. One is the tendency to affirm the consequent. If it rains, the ground is wet, therefore it has rained. Many subjects accept this reasoning, though it is fallacious, for the ground may be wet by other causes. This error shows how association dominates. Wet ground recalls rain, and the mind leaps to the conclusion. Another frequent error is the confusion of inclusion. If all roses are flowers and all flowers are plants, some will say that all plants are roses. Here again the error arises from haste, from neglect of terms, from failure to attend to the direction of inclusion. These errors are not random, they reveal systematic tendencies, the natural pitfalls of the mind. By cataloging them, psychology gains a map of the obstacles that reasoning encounters. In observing patterns, I noted also differences of age. Young children reason concretely, tied to images and experiences. They resist abstract premises and prefer examples. As they grow, they acquire the ability to manipulate abstractions, to reason upon words and symbols apart from objects. Yet even adults often revert to concrete associations when premises are too remote from experience. Education strengthens the habit of abstraction, but it never abolishes the influence of concrete imagery. Thus one sees continuity between child and adult reasoning, not a sharp break. The experiments with absurd syllogisms were particularly revealing. Some children accepted any premise given by the experimenter, showing submission to authority. If told all stones are animals, they accepted it and reasoned upon it. Others resisted, showing independence of judgment. Among adults, similar differences appeared, though disguised by politeness. Some refused to answer, others answered ironically, others reasoned rigorously despite disbelief. These variations show that reasoning is not only an intellectual function, but also a social and moral one, influenced by authority, by respect, by fear of ridicule, by the desire to please. The experimenter must therefore interpret results cautiously, aware that responses reflect not only reasoning, but attitudes toward the situation. The most striking lesson from all these observations is that reasoning is neither infallible nor uniform. It is a living process, subject to suggestion, abbreviation, conflict, and error. Logic gives the ideal form, But psychology shows the reality partial, hesitant, often contradictory. Yet within this imperfection lies the true interest. For by studying how reasoning fails, one learns how it works. The errors are as instructive as the successes. They reveal the tendencies of association, the resistance of belief, the influence of authority, the shortcuts of attention. They show the human mind in its effort to rise above association toward inference, struggling with its own limits. Experiment thus confirms the necessity of a psychological study of reasoning. Without it, one remains in the illusion that reasoning is a simple application of syllogisms. With it, one sees that reasoning is a complex interplay of forces, sometimes logical, sometimes associative, sometimes emotional. The same subject may reason rigorously in one moment and fall into absurdity in the next, depending on the premises, the context, the attention, the confidence. To know this is to know not only the limits of human reason, but also its possibilities. For if errors are systematic, they may be corrected. If reasoning is fragile, it may be strengthened by education. Psychology does not abolish logic, it supplements it by showing how logic is lived, distorted, and approximated in real minds. Thus the experiments, modest though they appear, have revealed the inner life of reasoning. They have shown that the syllogism, while an ideal, is rarely used in full, that premises are often implicit or resisted, that analogy and classification play essential roles, that errors recur in patterns, that age, education, and authority influence conclusions. They have shown that reasoning is not a pure mechanism, but a struggle of the mind between association and inference, between belief and logic, between authority and independence. This is the psychology of reasoning in its experimental form, and it is upon such foundations that a true science of thought may be built. Reasoning is not a uniform and unchanging function in every individual. It varies with age, with experience, with education, and with the natural dispositions of temperament. To imagine that the reasoning of the child, the youth, and the adult are identical in their processes is to ignore the evident facts of development. Just as perception grows clearer, memory more extended, and attention more controlled as the individual advances in years, so reasoning undergoes a series of transformations which bear witness to its dependence on the general state of the mind. There is no fixed instrument of thought working always at the same level. There is a living function adapting itself to the capacities and needs of each stage of life. The first years of childhood reveal reasoning in its most rudimentary form. The child draws inferences, but does so almost always in relation to concrete images and immediate experiences. His logic is bound up with perception. If he sees clouds and has often observed rain follow, he says it will rain. He reasons by analogy and contiguity, never by abstraction. Place before him a syllogism that demands acceptance of a universal premise, and he hesitates or refuses, not from want of intelligence, but from the absence of habit in handling ideas detached from their sensory supports. The young child does not willingly admit premises contrary to his direct experience. Tell him that all stones are animals, and he laughs, declaring that stones do not move and cannot eat. His reasoning is thus tied to the testimony of the senses, which to him seems final and unquestionable. As age advances, reasoning slowly gains independence from concrete images. The child of 10 or 12 begins to manipulate verbal propositions with greater ease. He can imagine hypotheses that contradict reality and still pursue their consequences. Yet even here, the traces of concrete thought remain. He is more comfortable with examples drawn from familiar life than with abstract symbols. He reasons better upon dogs and trees than upon triangles and numbers. His logic is real but partial, still under the influence of images. Only with the training of adolescence does the mind acquire facility in abstraction, the ability to follow reasoning independent of immediate perception. The adult, in contrast, shows greater power to isolate reasoning from experience. He can accept absurd premises for the sake of argument and carry them to their conclusion. He can operate upon abstract symbols, upon letters and numbers, upon general laws of physics or mathematics. Yet even here the limits appear. Not all adults possess the same capacity. Many remain bound to concrete examples, uneasy in the presence of abstraction. They may have mastered certain forms of reasoning through habit but resist others. Education widens the range of reasoning, but it does not abolish natural inequalities. There are those who reason best in visual terms, others who prefer mechanical analogies, others still who are at ease only when words preserve a link with reality. Reasoning therefore remains diverse, not only between ages but between individuals of the same age. Education plays a decisive role in this development. The school does not give the child reasoning as if bestowing a new faculty. It cultivates what exists, strengthens it, directs it. By exercises in logic, in mathematics, in grammar, the mind learns to detach itself from immediate perception, to follow longer chains of inference, to accept hypotheses and examine their consequences. Education introduces the discipline of proof, the requirement to justify conclusions, the habit of stating premises explicitly. It trains the child not to leap to conclusions by association, but to control the process of inference. This discipline is of immense value, for left to itself the mind tends to abbreviation, to omission, to the errors of hasty generalization. School obliges the child to articulate, to test, to compare. Yet education has its limits. It can accustom the mind to certain forms, but cannot create capacities where the natural foundation is lacking. Some individuals, despite training, remain incapable of sustained abstraction. They can apply rules in familiar contexts, but fail when asked to reason in new and unfamiliar domains. Their thought remains tied to the concrete. Others, on the contrary, develop an ease with abstractions, handling them almost as if they were objects of sense. These differences reveal that reasoning, while trainable, is also bound to innate dispositions. Education may improve the instrument, but it cannot make all instruments identical. The limits of abstract thought appear even in the most cultivated minds. Abstraction is a tool, but it fatigues and confuses when pushed too far. Few can follow long chains of purely verbal reasoning without resort to examples. Even the mathematician, accustomed to symbols, often translates them into images or diagrams to grasp their meaning. The lawyer, arguing a case, uses examples to make abstractions intelligible. The teacher, explaining a principle, seeks metaphors to anchor the idea. Abstraction alone is too fragile, too tenuous for sustained effort. The mind requires the support of images, of analogies, of concrete representations. Thus, while abstraction is essential to science, it is never complete. It is always accompanied by a return to the concrete. One must also observe the influence of fatigue upon reasoning. Children, when tired, abandon logic and give answers by association. Adults, too, under fatigue, revert to primitive forms, confusing inclusion, neglecting premises, leaping to conclusions. This shows that reasoning demands energy, attention, discipline. It is not a passive function that flows without effort, but an active construction that consumes resources. Hence its limits. When attention fails, reasoning weakens. The same individual who reasons well in the morning may reason poorly in the evening. The psychology of reasoning must therefore reckon with these variations, for they are as real as those of age or education. The role of emotion must also be recognized. Reasoning is not a cold process, it is influenced by desires, beliefs, passions. A man convinced of a doctrine will reason with admirable rigor when premises lead to his conclusion, but with confusion when they do not. Emotion blinds, selects, distorts. This too is a limit of reasoning. It is never entirely independent of the rest of mental life. Education can teach vigilance, the habit of criticism, but cannot abolish passion. Reasoning is therefore bounded not only by age and fatigue, but by feeling itself. From the collection of these facts, one may draw several conclusions. First, reasoning develops progressively, from concrete to abstract, under the influence of age and education. Second, education strengthens reasoning but cannot abolish individual differences. Third, abstraction, though necessary, is limited. The mind always requires support from the concrete. Fourth, reasoning is fragile, subject to fatigue and to the sway of emotion. These truths do not diminish the value of reasoning, but render it intelligible. They show that reasoning is a living function, not a mechanical one. They explain why men differ so much in their conclusions, why errors persist, why conviction often triumphs over logic. If one insists on comparing the reasoning of the child and the adult, one must avoid exaggeration. The child does not lack reasoning. He reasons according to his means, with concrete materials, with associations close to experience. The adult does not reason perfectly. He still commits errors, still depends on images, still succumbs to prejudice. The difference is of degree, not of kind. Reasoning is always subject to limits, only the limits change. The child cannot detach from perception, the adult cannot free himself from emotion. Both reveal the same fundamental operation, but in different conditions. In the end, the psychology of reasoning is a study of variations. It shows us reasoning as a power neither fixed nor uniform, but modifiable, influenced by development, by education, by circumstance. It shows us the grandeur and the weakness of the human mind, capable of abstraction, but never escaping the need for the concrete, capable of logic, but never free from passion, capable of inference, but always threatened by error. This knowledge does not destroy confidence in reason. It tempers it with understanding. It teaches us to expect limits, to allow for differences, to cultivate vigilance. It shows us reason not as an absolute, but as a function of life, noble in its aim, humble in its practice. Reasoning does not unfold in a vacuum of pure intellect. It is constantly entangled with belief, suggestion, emotion, and passion. To imagine a mind reasoning without the presence of these forces would be to imagine a mind unlike any human mind. Belief is not the result alone of reasoning, it is also its companion, its obstacle, and often its master. Suggestion, whether it comes from without through the voice of authority, or from within through memory and habit, exerts a power that bends the paths of thought. If the syllogism represents the form of necessity, suggestion and belief represent the living conditions under which that form is applied, modified, or distorted. The psychology of reasoning must therefore include not only the study of logical processes, but also the influence of conviction, prejudice, and affective tendencies. When one examines children, the role of suggestion appears at once. A child accepts with docility the premises offered by a teacher or experimenter. If told all stones are animals, he often accepts it without protest and reasons upon it faithfully. His respect for authority outweighs his personal experience. Another child may resist, declaring that stones do not move, and thus refuse the conclusion. Here belief gained through personal observation resists external suggestion. These differences show the interplay of two forces, submission to authority and fidelity to experience. The child is swayed now by one, now by the other. His reasoning is not free but under the rule of belief. Adults also reveal this influence. A man trained in logic may refuse to answer a problem with absurd premises, declaring it nonsense. His belief in the stability of reality prevents him from applying logic. Another, willing to accept the game, may reason rigorously but without conviction, knowing that his conclusion is false in fact. Thus belief and logic are separated, one guiding conviction, the other guiding inference. Yet often they mingle, and conviction triumphs over reasoning. One believes a doctrine strongly, then every premise that supports it is welcomed, every inference that threatens it is resisted. The form of reasoning remains, but it is bent, warped, adjusted to the desired conclusion. Conviction shapes the chain of thought, like a current bending the course of a boat. Emotions strengthen this tendency. Where passion is engaged, reasoning becomes a servant. A man in anger finds reasons for his anger. A lover finds reasons for his trust or his jealousy. These reasons are not discovered impartially, they are sought and selected under the pressure of emotion. Reasoning becomes justification. The conclusion is fixed in advance by feeling, and the premises are arranged afterward to sustain it. This inversion of order is common. It shows that reasoning is often less the origin of belief than its instrument. Belief comes first, born of emotion, habit, or suggestion. Reasoning comes later, to give it the appearance of rational support. The errors that arise from this condition are many. One is the tendency to suppress or ignore premises that oppose belief. The mind attends only to favorable evidence and neglects the rest. Another is to exaggerate the force of analogies that confirm conviction while minimizing those that contradict it. A third is to employ fallacious syllogisms unconsciously, introducing hidden premises that agree with prejudice. Thus, one who believes a group of people inferior will unconsciously adopt the hidden major premise, all of that group are unfit, and every example becomes confirmation. Reasoning here is not discovery, but repetition of belief. The conclusion is predetermined, the process is a mere ritual. Conviction differs from reasoning in its mode of certainty. Reasoning demands evidence, premises, and inference. Conviction often dispenses with them. It gives a sense of absolute certainty without proof. One feels convinced and resists all reasoning against it. Suggestion strengthens this repeated affirmation, the prestige of authority, the contagion of a crowd, the influence of an admired leader. In such cases, the conviction may be stronger than any reason could produce. It is impervious to refutation. Logic glances off it like arrows against armor. This shows again that conviction is not reasoning, though it may mimic it. It springs from psychological forces deeper than logic. Yet it would be wrong to oppose reasoning and belief, as if they were wholly separate. In practice, they are intertwined. Reasoning often leads to belief when the conclusion convinces us by its necessity. Belief, in turn, often directs reasoning, providing premises that are accepted without scrutiny. The two form a circle, each reinforcing the other. The distinction is clear only in analysis. In life, they cooperate, conflict, or fuse. What psychology must study is the manner of this relation, the conditions under which belief dominates or reasoning resists. Experiments reveal how suggestion operates in detail. Present to subjects a series of problems with absurd premises, and note their reactions. Some accept blindly, others resist. The acceptance is an effect of suggestion, the resistance of belief. In crowds, suggestion shows its full force. The individual loses his critical sense, accepts without examination, repeats what others affirm, and reasons only to justify the common conviction. Here the power of belief, born of social suggestion, overwhelms logic. The man of the crowd believes because others believe. His reasoning is a collective echo, not an independent process. Education may cultivate resistance to suggestion. The habit of criticism, the demand for proof, the exercise of reasoning upon hypotheses, all these strengthen the mind against blind conviction. Yet even the educated are not safe in matters that touch passion, politics, religion, personal interest. They may reason as badly as children. Their intelligence serves not to discover truth, but to defend belief. The greater the intelligence, the more subtle the justifications. Reasoning is not absent, but it is enslaved to conviction. Thus education refines but does not abolish the influence of belief. The roots lie deep in emotion and habit. The psychologist must therefore recognize limits to reasoning. It cannot pretend to rule alone in the mind. It works within the atmosphere of beliefs already formed, suggestions already accepted. At times it liberates, showing that convictions are unfounded, At other times it submits, elaborating proofs for what is already decided. Its independence is precarious, requiring effort, vigilance, impartiality, conditions rarely met. The ordinary state of man is not one of pure reasoning, but of reasoning entangled with conviction. This entanglement explains many paradoxes of thought. Men may reason brilliantly in mathematics and absurdly in politics. They may apply logic rigorously in science and abandon it in religion. The difference is not of faculty, but of conviction. Where belief is neutral, reasoning is free. Where belief is engaged, reasoning is bound. The same mind is both rational and irrational, depending on the domain. Psychology thus dispels the illusion of a uniform faculty of reason. It shows a function always subject to the pressure of belief. Conviction has its value, of course. Without it, action would be impossible. One cannot live in perpetual doubt. But conviction, while necessary for life, is dangerous for truth. Reasoning seeks to test, to examine, to correct. Conviction resists, clings, persists. The history of errors, of superstitions, of prejudices, is the history of conviction untested by reasoning. Yet the history of science, of discovery, of progress, is the history of reasoning breaking through conviction. The struggle between the two is eternal. Sometimes conviction inspires reasoning, guiding it to discoveries. Sometimes it blinds it, leading to error. Both are essential aspects of the human mind. In conclusion, the relation of reasoning and belief is not one of exclusion, but of tension. Reasoning aspires to impartiality, to necessity, to truth. Belief aspires to certainty, to conviction, to security. The one is a method, the other a state. The one questions, the other affirms. The mind oscillates between them, sometimes reasoning to believe, sometimes believing to reason. To understand human thought, one must understand this oscillation. For without belief, reasoning would be paralyzed by doubt. Without reasoning, belief would be blind obstinacy. The psychology of reasoning, therefore, includes the psychology of belief, showing how suggestion, emotion, and passion shape conclusions, how conviction bends logic, and how the fragile independence of reasoning must be continually defended against the power of faith. The study of reasoning is not a sterile occupation, nor is it a pursuit of curiosity without utility. It leads naturally to applications that affect education, the training of intelligence, and the daily choices of life. To know how men reason in reality, with their limits, their errors, their tendencies, is to be better prepared to teach them, to correct them, and to guide them. Logic alone offers only an ideal. Psychology offers the living truth of how that ideal is approached or abandoned. By uniting the two, one obtains rules not of abstract reasoning, but of intellectual conduct, rules that take into account the conditions of minds as they are. These rules bear upon children at school, upon adults in their professions, upon all men in their decisions. Thus the psychology of reasoning extends beyond theory and enters into practice. In education the importance is obvious. The child who learns to read and write also learns to reason. Every lesson, however elementary, contains an implicit logic. When the teacher explains a rule of grammar, when he demonstrates a theorem, when he narrates a fact of history, he is not merely imparting knowledge. He is forming the habits of inference by which knowledge is understood and retained. If one knows the psychology of reasoning, one can adapt teaching to the natural tendencies of the child, avoid overwhelming him with abstractions too soon, and lead him gradually from the concrete to the general. Too often education presupposes that the child reasons like an adult, whereas in truth he reasons differently. He attaches himself to images, to examples, to vivid analogies. To demand at once that he manipulate abstract symbols is to burden him with a task beyond his strength. The wise teacher proceeds step by step, respecting the psychology of development. Experiments show that children resist absurd premises, preferring the testimony of their senses to the demands of logic. They reject syllogisms that contradict experience. This is not a fault but a stage. The teacher must know how to exploit this fidelity to reality while gently introducing the idea of hypothesis. He must show that one can suppose even what is not true, for the sake of seeing what follows. This is the beginning of scientific imagination, the power to reason upon possibilities. But if the teacher insists too early, the child resists or repeats mechanically without conviction. Thus, psychology gives the rule: begin with the concrete, pass gradually to abstraction. Respect the natural stages of reasoning. Education also benefits from the knowledge of errors. The most common faults of reasoning: affirming the consequent, confusing inclusion, leaping from association to cause, appear in children as in adults. But if the teacher knows these errors, he can anticipate them, correct them, and use them as lessons. When a child says the ground is wet, therefore it has rained, the teacher can show him other causes of wet ground. The error becomes an opportunity to refine reasoning. Without such knowledge, the teacher may simply declare the answer false without explaining the nature of the fault. The child then receives correction without instruction. Psychology demands more. It demands that every error be analyzed, that the child understand why it is an error, and what correct reasoning would be. In this way, reasoning is trained not only by success, but by failure. One must not imagine that education can create reasoning where none exists. The faculty is natural, but it is weak and unformed. Education cultivates it, disciplines it, broadens it. It teaches the child to state premises, to test them, to distinguish between analogy and deduction, between fact and hypothesis. It gives him not only conclusions, but the path by which to reach them. It strengthens attention, which is indispensable to holding premises together, and it teaches vigilance, the habit of examining beliefs before accepting them. These are the true aims of intellectual education. Knowledge alone, without the method of reasoning, leaves the child powerless to use it. Reasoning gives him mastery of his knowledge, the ability to apply it to new cases. The implications extend beyond the school. In professional life, reasoning governs decisions at every turn. The doctor who diagnoses a patient, the lawyer who argues a case, the merchant who judges the value of an enterprise, all reason. If they know the psychology of reasoning, they are less exposed to error. The doctor must not confuse succession with cause, must not be swayed by the suggestion of a striking symptom while neglecting others. The lawyer must distinguish between analogy and proof, between authority and evidence. The merchant must guard against belief born of desire, the tendency to see only what favors his enterprise. These are practical applications of psychology. They show that reasoning is not confined to philosophy, but penetrates the most ordinary occupations. In daily life, too, the consequences are evident. Every man must decide, and every decision implies reasoning. Whether to trust a stranger, whether to invest in a project, whether to believe a report, these are questions of reasoning. The errors of daily reasoning are the same as those of the classroom. Men accept suggestions without examination, believe what flatters their desires, draw conclusions from insufficient premises. By knowing these tendencies, one can guard against them. The psychology of reasoning thus becomes a guide for practical conduct. It teaches modesty, showing how often we are mistaken. It teaches vigilance, showing how easily belief enters by hidden premises. It teaches patience, showing the need to state and test premises before concluding. In this way, it improves not only intelligence but life itself. There is also a social implication. In crowds, reasoning weakens, suggestion strengthens. Men accept what others affirm, repeat it, and justify it afterward. Convictions spread without proof. To resist this contagion requires training in reasoning, the habit of demanding evidence, the courage to doubt. Education, therefore, has a civic function. It prepares minds to resist collective suggestion, to remain free before authority, to reason independently. Without such training, society is at the mercy of prejudice, rumor, and passion. The psychology of reasoning thus contributes to liberty. It shows that the independence of thought is not a gift, but a conquest, won by discipline of reasoning against the power of suggestion. The broader implication is that reasoning is not only a faculty of the individual, but a condition of progress. Science advances because men reason upon facts, test hypotheses, and correct errors. Law advances because judgments are reasoned and precedents examined. Morals advance because beliefs are criticized and convictions justified. In all these domains, the psychology of reasoning has a role, for it explains why errors occur, how convictions form, and how reasoning can be trained to resist illusion. It gives science a reflexive awareness of its own methods, reminding it that the mind is not infallible and that vigilance must accompany discovery. The practical consequences extend even to the art of teaching reasoning itself. If one knows that children abbreviate reasoning, leaping to conclusions, then one can insist that they state each step. If one knows that they confuse analogy with causation, then one can show the difference with examples. If one knows that belief resists absurd premises, then one can gradually train the mind to separate reasoning from conviction. In all these cases, psychology provides the map by which the teacher guides the child through the labyrinth of thought. Without it, teaching is blind. With it, teaching is adapted to the nature of the mind. One must not expect perfection. Reasoning will always remain subject to limits, fatigue, emotion, belief. But by understanding these limits, one can work within them. One can arrange lessons at times when attention is fresh, avoid overwhelming the child with abstractions, encourage reflection when passion is calm. One can cultivate habits of self-criticism, teach pupils to doubt their first impressions, and train them to seek premises before concluding. These are modest aims, but they produce great effects. They make reasoning not infallible but better, not absolute but reliable. The progress of intelligence is measured not by the absence of error, but by the capacity to recognize and correct it. Thus, the applications of reasoning psychology are broad and profound. They touch the school, the profession, the individual, and society. They show that reasoning is not an isolated faculty, but the very condition of thought, action, and liberty. To know how men reason, to know their errors and their limits, is to hold the key to their education and to their future. The study of reasoning is therefore not an academic curiosity, but a necessity for all who wish to understand and improve the life of the mind. It teaches us how to think, how to teach, how to decide, and how to live. It reveals the grandeur and the fragility of human intelligence, and it gives us the means, imperfect but real, to guide it toward truth. The investigation of reasoning, pursued through history by philosophers and logicians, has long been dominated by the notion of an ideal form embodied in the syllogism and in the rules of logic. This conception, while noble, has left in shadow the living reality of reasoning as it occurs in actual minds. The purpose of my work has been to bring reasoning down from the region of abstractions into the field of psychology, to treat it as a function subject to observation, to error, to variation, and to development. The conclusion reached is not the destruction of logic, but its completion. Logic offers a model of what reasoning ought to be. Psychology reveals what reasoning is. Between the two lies the distance between the perfect figure and the living body, between geometry and physiology. To understand human thought, one must have both, for without logic we cannot judge truth, and without psychology we cannot understand minds. The first finding, established again and again through experiment, is that reasoning in daily life does not employ the full form of the syllogism. The general premise, indispensable to logic, is often latent or unconscious. The mind leaps from case to conclusion, abbreviating, omitting, or replacing premises with associations. This economy of thought saves effort but opens the door to error. The syllogism, in its classical rigor, is thus more a reconstruction of reasoning than its actual form. Real reasoning is elliptical, implicit, compressed. Yet, in its structure, one can still discern the schema of the syllogism, as one recognizes the skeleton beneath the movements of the body. The syllogism is not the image of reasoning, but its framework, hidden, deformed, yet always present. The second finding is the prevalence of errors, systematic and recurrent. To affirm the consequent, to confuse inclusion, to mistake sequence for cause, to rely on analogy in place of deduction. These are not accidents, but tendencies of thought. They arise from the natural operations of association, from the influence of images, from the pressure of belief. The psychology of reasoning is therefore a psychology of errors as much as of successes. To know how men reason is to know why they are mistaken. This knowledge is indispensable, for it reveals the conditions under which reasoning approaches truth and those under which it deviates. It shows that vigilance and education are required, that error is not an exception but a companion of thought. The third finding concerns the influence of suggestion and belief. Reasoning does not act alone. It is constantly entangled with conviction. The mind does not simply accept premises for their logical value. It judges them by their conformity with experience, by their agreement with desire, by their sanction from authority. Suggestion enters at every stage, biasing perception of facts, choice of premises, acceptance of conclusions. Conviction often precedes reasoning, which then becomes justification. Thus reasoning, far from being sovereign, is subject to passion, habit, and authority. The independence of reason is precarious, its purity rare. This does not abolish reasoning, but defines its condition. It is always reasoning within belief. The fourth finding is the variation of reasoning with age, education, and circumstance. The child reasons with images, bound to the concrete, resistant to abstraction. The adolescent learns to manipulate hypotheses, to detach reasoning from immediate reality. The adult acquires greater facility with abstraction, but remains subject to emotion and prejudice. Education cultivates reasoning, teaching the habit of explicit premises, of proof, of criticism. Yet education does not abolish differences, it refines but does not equalize. Even the cultivated mind is limited. Fatigue reduces reasoning to association, passion bends it to desire. Thus reasoning is not a fixed faculty, but a function that develops, varies, and declines. Its study is inseparable from the study of the whole mind. From these findings flow criticisms of pure logic as a model of human thought. Logic imagines reasoning as uniform, necessary, detached from belief. Psychology shows it as varied, probable, entangled with conviction. Logic assumes premises given and true. Psychology shows premises accepted or rejected according to belief, authority, or suggestion. Logic values necessity, psychology tolerates probability, for in life one must act without certainty. Logic excludes error, psychology studies it as inevitable. Thus pure logic, while indispensable as a standard, cannot represent the reality of reasoning. It must be complemented by psychology, which brings into view the conditions, the variations, and the limits of thought. It is not a question of rejecting logic, but of placing it in its true relation to psychology. Logic is normative, prescribing the form of valid inference. Psychology is descriptive, analyzing the processes by which minds actually infer. Logic without psychology is sterile, psychology without logic is blind. Together they give a complete view. Logic tells us what reasoning ought to be. Psychology shows us why it so often fails to reach it. The task of education, of science, of practical life, is to bring psychology nearer to logic, to train minds to reason not as they do spontaneously, but as they ought. This is not a matter of imposing syllogisms upon children, but of cultivating attention, vigilance, criticism, and the habit of testing premises. The legacy of this work is to have opened a new path, to have shown that reasoning is not beyond the reach of experiment. By placing problems before children and adults, by analyzing their responses, by cataloging their errors, one can treat reasoning as one treats memory, attention, or perception, as a function subject to observation and law. The laws discovered are not absolute but probabilistic. They describe tendencies, frequencies, conditions. Yet even these are precious, for they transform reasoning from an abstraction into an object of science. They show that the most noble faculty of man is also the most human, fallible, variable, improvable. What remains is to continue this work, to multiply experiments, to refine methods, to explore reasoning in all its domains in science, in morals, in art, in daily life. The psychology of reasoning is still young. It has only begun to reveal the complexity of thought. But already it has dispelled the illusion of infallible reason, shown the power of belief and suggestion, and indicated the means of education. Its final lesson is one of modesty and hope. Modesty, because it reveals the limits and errors of reason. Hope, because it shows that by understanding these limits one may correct them. Reasoning is not perfect, but it can be improved. To know its psychology is to possess the key to its progress. Thus the conclusion is not despair but confidence. Man does not reason as the logicians imagined, but neither is he a slave to association and prejudice. He is capable of logic, though imperfectly applied. By studying his reasoning, by teaching him to recognize his errors, by cultivating his habits of criticism, we may bring him nearer to truth. This is the true legacy of a psychology of reasoning, to reconcile the grandeur of logic with the reality of human thought, to show not what man should be in imagination, but what he is in fact, and what he may become through effort, education, and science.